Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode in Hult International Business School's webinar series. My name is Darren Lockery, and I am the Director of Enrollment for the MBA program. Today's webinar is all about tackling the dreaded GMAT, and we will be sharing test prep tips and admissions tips for graduate business programs. This particular webinar is the first part of a two-part series and will focus on the quantitative portion of the exam. Joining us today is Sergey Kuk, who is an expert GMAT trainer from Admit Master. Sergey left his career as a rocket scientist, that's correct, I said rocket scientist, to take on a new challenge, helping aspiring business school students master the GMAT exam. He is bringing a great deal of test knowledge to today's discussion, having scored a 750 on his first attempt. He has since developed a pedagogy that he uses to help students all over the world think outside the box, ace the test, and gain business school admission. Today, Sergey will be offering a math refresher for the test and will also share a step-by-step study plan for reaching a 700 plus GMAT score in only 2 to 3 months. We will get some tips to learn how to properly manage our time, both during test preparation and the test itself. I will also join in the discussion by offering up some admissions advice and shed some light on how to better navigate the GMAT requirement while applying to business school. We will allow for some Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box, and we will get to as many as time will permit. We will also share a recording of the webinar in a follow-up email and have it accessible through our website. Lastly, please be sure to follow along and share your thoughts via our Twitter feed at Hult_biz, #TackleTheGMAT. Without further ado, I would like to hand the floor over to Sergey. Sergey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Darren. It's always my pleasure. If you don't mind, if you could just respond to any comments. I've noticed one person raised the hand. And thanks everyone for joining at this time. Feel free to type where you are coming from or where you're joining from so that we know what time zone you're in. Today's class is really going to be about the math version of the math section of the GMAT. And let me share what we're going to do today. We are going to start with some questions to challenge you, because I always like to start my classes with a little bit of a challenge, just to see what we are up against. We'll talk very briefly about what is the GMAT. I'll share my story with you. And then, of course, we'll get into the meat of our seminar today, the must-know math theory, the theory that you really have to know in order to master the GMAT. Then, of course, we'll talk about how do you get a high score, and I'll share the step-by-step process for studying for the GMAT. And of course, then Darren will join us with some admissions tips. And then we'll have a few minutes for Q&A. And of course, we will be available even after this webinar. So like I've mentioned, what I'd like to do at the beginning of each seminar is to take you a little bit outside your comfort zone. You might be sitting on a beach somewhere. You might be sitting in the office. You might be very comfortable, maybe not very comfortable. But I'm really talking about the comfort zone in your mind. If you're completely comfortable, then you're not learning anything. And I want to take you outside of that comfort zone so that you really are starting to think a little bit outside the box. And this is when you can develop some of the new skills. And to do that, I'd like to give you a question. And I'll give you about 15 seconds to think about what you would do to get that question. So here you go. Okay, so this is a very simple example of a GMAT question where you're given a problem and you have 5 answer choices, and one of them, of course, is the correct answer. Now, I think that most of you will not have any trouble with this question because all you have to do to answer this question correctly is to recognize that you have 3 exponents, and as long as you remember what is an exponent, 1 to the power of 1 is, of course, 1 taken once, 2 to the power of 2 is 2 multiplied onto itself, and 3 to the power of 3 is 3 multiplied onto itself 3 times. The numbers are fairly small, and if you simply add them up, you're going to end up with 32. And of course, if you know your powers of 2, or if you simply multiply 2 several times until you reach 32, you will recognize that indeed C is the right answer. So this question would not really take you very long. Let me show you another question, because I think some of you may still be in a comfort zone. Now, what do you think about this question? Take a few seconds to think about what you might do. Now, we've just talked about the approach to doing these types of a question. This question is very similar to what you've just seen before. There's only one problem. Well, there are actually two problems. The first problem is the numbers are quite large. The second problem is you do not get to use a calculator on the GMAT. So what would you do? Well, you could take an approach that we've just took for the previous question. Let's call it the theory approach, where you really know what a little bit of a theory, you know what an exponent is. And when you look at this question, you're thinking, okay, the numbers are not that big. I could technically calculate them. 14 to the power of 4 is not too big. It's only about 38,000. 15 to the power of 5, a little bit larger, takes a little bit longer, 759,000. And of course, 16 to the power of 6 is a much larger number. Now we're in the millions. But you could still do it. Then you can add the numbers and you can find the right answer. There's only one problem. The problem is it took you 8 minutes to do this work. Of course, you do not get 8 minutes on the GMAT. And this is not a very, very difficult question. So what could you do? Well, there's another way. And another way to do this question is, let's call it the strategy way, where you didn't just learn the theory, but you also know a little bit about the GMAT. And you know that there's one concept that's called the units-digits strategy. And how this works is that if you are trying to multiply two very large numbers, it works for addition as well. If you were to only begin multiplying, what would you start doing is you will deal with the last digit, right? You may remember this. The last digit is called the units digit. So you multiply 6 onto 7, and then you have a carryover onto the next digit, but there will be no carryover for this last digit. And what we could find out is that the last digit here has to be 2. Now, exponents are also a sort of multiplication. For example, 14 to the power of 1 is 14 to the power of 2. Well, if we only focus on the last digit and we take 4 by 4, we're going to get to 6 as the last digit. 14 to the power of 3 will get us 4 again, because again, we only focus on the last digit, 6 by 4. 14 to the power of 4 gives us a 6 again. I'm sure that by now you probably noticed a pattern, that if the power of 14 is an odd number, which is 1 and 3, we're always going to get a 4 at the end. And if the power is an even number, which is 2 and 4, we're always going to get a 6. Now, they've given us only 14 to the power of 4, but they could have given us 14 to the power of 40 or 400. It would not make any difference because there's a pattern. And of course, you need to be able to recognize these patterns on a test. Now, let's deal with 15. If you multiply 5 onto 5, again, we focus on the last digit only, you'll get 25. And then you multiply 5 onto 5 again 25. So 15 to the power of any integer number, any whole number will always give you 5 at the end. Same with 6. 6 times 6, 36, and so on. So now, remembering, we're only focusing on the last digit. We know that 14 to the power of 4 ends in a 6. 15 to the power of 5 ends in a 5. 16 to the power of 6 ends in a 6. And if we add these numbers up, we are bound to have 7 as the last digit. Notice how many answer choices end in a 7. Do you think this is a coincidence or this is a pattern? It is a pattern. The GMAT does not really want to test how well you can multiply very large numbers. Instead, it wants to test how well you can think outside the box. And this type of a strategy is definitely a part of an outside of the box thinker. So we got to the right answer and we only spent 1 minute, which is great. It is a very fast time and certainly a much better way to do this question than the previous way, the theory way. But there's an even better way. And an even better way, I'm going to show you very quickly what it is. If you look at the question and the way the question is set up and the answer choices, Somebody who's been studying for the GMAT for a while and really mastered the test will recognize that there's no way that we could find the actual answer. And if you look at the answer choices, you will also notice that the answer choices are quite far apart. So if you were to take these numbers and simply approximate them, you will be able to answer this question pretty accurately, with one exception. You may end up between the two answer choices C and D, and then you might not know which one to choose. So somebody who is very skilled at doing the test will say, okay, I can do a very rough calculation, and they're trying to get me into this trap where I'm going to get stuck between C and D, and I wouldn't know which one to choose. So at this point, I'm 90% sure that it is C or D. So what I can do right now is I can just try to break the tie between C and D. And at that point, it's even easier, because if we look at the numbers, we'll recognize that 14 to the power of 4 has to be an even number, and 15 to the power of 5 is odd, and 16 to the power of 6 is also even. If we add them up, the result has to be odd. And that leads us directly to answer choice D. Now, are we 100% sure it's D? No, we're 90% sure it's D. But we're 90% sure at the expense of saving 7.5 minutes. And sometimes it's worth it. So I hope you enjoyed these couple little questions. I will show you more questions. Let's get into what the GMAT's about, the format of the exam, and then, of course, we'll talk about the math theory. So the GMAT is really an exam for getting into business schools. It is accepted by more than 6,000 programs worldwide, and it's designed to evaluate the skills you've developed and honed over many years through education and work. We will come back to this statement towards the end of our webinar. Let's see how the GMAT is structured. There are 4 sections on the exam. It used to be always in this order, but for the last couple of months, you can now change the order. There are a couple of different other options for the order of the sections. You will have an essay, then you have integrated reasoning, which is essentially a mini business case, so 12 mini business cases. Then you have the quantitative and the verbal sections. On the quantitative section, you have approximately 2 minutes per question. On the verbal section, approximately 1 minute and 49 seconds per question. You have a lot of different scores, and then you get a final total score. The total score is calculated based on your quant and verbal score. And this is really the score that most of the business schools are going to be interested in, the 200 to 800 score. And of course, Darren is going to talk about what score is considered competitive, but generally 600, 700, or sometimes even more is considered a very competitive score. Let me tell you very briefly about me. I am the 90th percentile GMAT instructor, which means I have scored in the top 1%, and I am teaching the GMAT full time. I have not started as a 99th percentile GMAT instructor. In fact, I didn't even like math and logic when I was in the junior school. But at some point, I got very lucky. And I got very lucky with amazing teachers who taught me how to think differently. This was my math teacher. He taught us the school curriculum, and then he said, if you want to know a better way, you can stay after class and I'll show you a better way. And I learned all the better ways from him. And as a result, I got 3 university degrees. My first 2 degrees are in rocket science. So I really was working on algorithms to send rockets into space. And then at some point, I decided I need something more down to earth. And I decided to get my 3rd degree, which of course was the MBA. I studied for about 2 weeks and I got a score of 750. And I'm telling this to you not to impress you, but impress me every time I say it. So I get to brag about my score. And as you can see, this is my real score. So everything's legit. Whatever Darren was saying. But another reason why I was mentioning this, I'm just a normal guy. I just learned the right skills, the right way to think. And that's what led me to this very, very high score. Of course, I did my MBA, graduated on top of my class. I've had a corporate career for about 10 years, and then I rediscovered my love for education, and I've been teaching the GMAT for 8 years now. And my mission now is to really reach a lot of people. I'm doing public speaking as well, to reach 100,000 people and share with them how to think differently. What we call here at Admit Master is to think like a CEO, because the ultimate goal of going to a business school is to become a CEO. And if you can learn how the CEOs think, and the GMAT can teach you a lot about how CEOs think, if you really study it for it properly, then you can stay committed and you can achieve some very ambitious career goals. So that's my goal, and I'm really grateful for you that you joined us here tonight because you are contributing to my goal. All right, well, enough about me. Here's one thing I wanted to mention about 700 plus score. Anybody can get a score of 700 plus. You do not need to be a rocket scientist. In fact, this is one of my students. He was a professional musician. He came to our class and he said, you always say that, well, we learned these math skills before in high school. I didn't. I was exempted from math classes because I was very gifted in music. And as a result, he came, he studied with us, and he ended up with a score of top 1%. He improved his verbal score to probably about 0.001%, the top 0.01%, and his quant score was also very, very high. In fact, he's now teaching for us because he scored so highly. Another gentleman here, he was an engineer. Even though he was an engineer, he was stuck at a score of about 610. He learned these new skills, he learned how to think differently, and he was able to get to a score of 716. So I want to ask you a question, which is kind of a little bit of a rhetorical question. Would you like to be one of those success stories and get offers from the schools you actually want to go to, and sometimes with a scholarship? Well, if you do, then let's talk about this first step in the journey, and I'll share with you the other steps because I promised we'll talk about the step by step. Now, this is step number one, the must-know GMAT math theory. Well, when we ask about this math theory and we ask our students why do they consider GMAT math hard, here are the questions or the answers that we usually hear. The math was a long time ago. You don't really get to use a calculator. We don't even remember definitions, right? Who remembers what's a chord, right? Or what's an arc? Or how do you find the lengths of the arc? That's been a long time ago. The GMAT environment itself is pretty stressful. They don't really welcome you with flower lace and with champagne when you walk into the test center. It's pretty stressful. They take away all of your belongings, take a palm scan. And as a result, many people completely forget what they learned. And they're making a lot of very silly mistakes. And here are some of the silly mistakes that a lot of people make. Number one, misreading the question. Sometimes misreading the answer choice, even misreading your own scratch work. It's very, very common. Computational errors, also very common. You're doing the calculations and you go 3 to the power of 2, it's 6. And then you continue your scratch work and you get an answer. And of course, the answer you get is one of the answer choices because GMAT knows what kinds of mistakes people are making. And finally, time management. Time is such a scarce asset on the GMAT. It's very, very hard to finish on time. The GMAT gets harder and harder as long as you are doing well. So time management is a huge issue. And here's one more thing. If you learn all of the theory and you read all of the books on the GMAT, you can only get to the medium scores. Because the GMAT is not really about the theory. It is about knowing how to deal with these questions. It's about knowing how to, knowing the strategies and also knowing how to think differently about this test. So let's talk about the theory, because theory, though, is important. It's about 20% of your success on the GMAT, but it's very important because if you don't know it, you pretty much have no chance of getting to even a medium score. So let's talk about the theory. And I really wanted to share a couple of theory pieces with you. And the first one has to do with numbers. Because a lot of people, when they approach the GMAT, they're just saying, look, like we have a lot of students who come into us. We run lots of courses in various cities. And a lot of people come to us and say, look, I just need to learn the hard stuff. I just need to learn probability, combinatorics, something very, very hard because I want a very high score. But the reality is the majority of the test is about simple topics, difficult questions, not about hard topics. And one of the very simple topics is the topic of numbers. So let's talk about numbers. In our numeric system, we have 10 digits from 0 to 9. That's why our numeric system is called decimal, because there are 10 digits. Most of the numbers we use in our everyday life are whole numbers, integers. The positive numbers are also called counting numbers. And in fact, sometimes in my life classes, I play a game with my students. I would say, I'm going to think of a number between 1 and 10, and if anybody can guess this number, you're going to win this book. And I have like 20, 25 people in class, and nobody can get this number because almost everybody is giving me back integers. In fact, the number I'm always thinking about is some sort of a non-integer, like a square root of 7. And of course, how many numbers are there between 1 and 10? An infinite number of numbers. Not every number is an integer. So we need to be aware of this because that's how the GMAT is going to treat us very often. So what numbers are non-integers? Well, there are a few types of numbers. There's a rational number. As you can see here, the rational number is a number that could be presented as a ratio of two integers, m and n. Not every number could be presented as a ratio, though. The number square root of 2 cannot be. Number pi also cannot be. And in fact, number pi is so unique that none of its digits ever repeat. It's amazing. Your phone number, your social insurance number is somewhere in the number pi. I find it incredible. Now, in order for us to deal with these numbers, we need to have this tool because everything on the GMAT requires tool. Essentially, you're building a toolkit. And a very, very important tool in dealing with numbers is a numbers line. Numbers line lets you visualize any number that could show up on a test because all of these numbers are called real numbers. As you could see on the numbers line, we have a 0, well, somewhere in the middle, and then we have negative numbers on one side, positive numbers on the other side. We have integers evenly spaced, and we have non-integers that are in between these spaces, all kinds of non-integers. Now, here's one important concept also that I wanted to touch upon, and that's the concept of an absolute value. Now, again, when I ask my students, what is an absolute value? Many of them will say, well, that's, it's kind of like a positive number, and if you take a negative number, well, it's still a positive. So again, very easy to confuse yourself. So the easiest way to remember what's an absolute value is remember that it's a distance from 0. The distance always has to be positive. The distance from New York to Chicago is 500 miles, and from Chicago to New York is also 500 miles. Whichever way you go, it's positive. So that's what the absolute value is. Now, so far we talked about very small numbers, 0 to 9. But what if you need a larger number? And very often we do. Imagine that you want to create a number that's in the thousands. Now, when we do this, we will write these digits next to each other. And what's important is that you don't only choose the right digits, but you also choose the right order. Imagine this is the amount of money in your bank account. I'm sure that you would be disappointed if your bank switched 6 and a 2. So it's important to know that every place of a digit also have a name. And the name, as you could see, is units, tens, hundreds, and thousands. Everything that ends in an S on the left side, everything that ends in a THS on the right side. Now, here's what this is, but what does it really mean? And you might be also wondering, how come the units digit is the first and the tens is the second on the left side, but the tens is the first on the right side? It kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. Why wouldn't the tens be also on the first on the left side? Well, there is an explanation for that. And if you see this explanation, you'll also understand why we call these places these ways. Here's what this really means. If you have this number, you can break it down because the 6 tells you how many thousands, and 4 tells you how many hundreds, and so on. And 7 tells you how many tenths in this number. So that's something very, very important because what the GMAT will sometimes ask you to do is say, we'll give you a number and we'll ask you to change the order of digits. And sometimes they don't tell you what the numbers are. They just say, well, here's a number with 2 digits. You don't really know what these digits are. Let's say they're A and B. Change the order of them and find out what's going to happen. So in this case, by breaking this number down into these little blocks, we can decompose the number and then we can deal with these unknowns if we need to. So let's now talk about what could you do with numbers. As I'm sure you know, there are 4 basic operations: addition, multiplication, subtraction, and division. You might be thinking, well, there's no way that GMAT can test this, right? Well, you'll be surprised. A lot of even very hard questions on the GMAT deal with multiplication and division. Specifically multiplication. A lot of the number properties questions, and number properties is a very big part of algebra, and algebra is the largest part of the quantitative section, deal with multiplication. We call multiplication product. So let's talk about this product. If you multiply 2 numbers, 3 and 12, for example, these numbers are called factors, but 36 is called product. Now, a number could also be factors, for example, written out as a product of its factors. So 36 is 2 times 18. Now, you could actually get into a task of writing out all of the factors of 36, and what you'll realize is the smallest factor of 36 is 1, and the largest factor of 36 is 36 itself. You'll also recognize that multiples are actually different from factors, and many people mix them up. But the multiples are actually the opposite. What are the multiples of 3? Well, these are all of the numbers that if you were to take 3 and multiply 3 by any integer, you'll get a multiple. So you always have an unlimited number of multiples, and in fact, even number 0 is a multiple of 3 because it's 3 multiplied by an integer, and 0 is an integer. So if you want to make sure that you never mix up factors and multiples, all you have to remember or look at is the first letter in the word factor or multiple, because factors are few and multiples are many. The first letter is F and the first letter is M. Now, we talked about the fact that 36 has a few factors, and the smallest one is 1 and the largest one is 36. All of the other factors are really in between these two numbers. So what would happen if you don't have any numbers in between? Well, we call these numbers prime numbers. So there are two types of numbers as long as a number is more than 1. Any positive integer more than 1 is either a prime number or a composite number. A prime number is a number such as 19, which does not have any other factors other than 1 in itself. 36 is a composite number because it has other factors, for example, 3 and 12. And as long as you find at least one other, then this number is not going to be prime anymore. Okay, so this is some really basics about the multiplication, and a lot of this is going to be tested, but the GMAT also tests division. And a lot about division is really knowing divisibility rules. I wanted to show you some of the divisibility rules, and I'm sure you're familiar with those. Some of the easiest and the most commonly tested is the divisibility rule by 3, where you have the sum of the digits that's divisible by 3, then the number also will be divisible by 3. Let's take a number 81. 8 plus 1 is 9. 9 is divisible by 3, so 81 is also divisible by 3. The same rule applies to 9. Again, 8 plus 1 is 9. 9 is divisible by 9, so 81 is also divisible by 9. Most of these rules are pretty simple. Some of the hardest divisibility rule is number 7. You can Google it. There are a couple of ways to approach it. The way I like, or the rule I like the most, is find the number that's very close to the number that you're looking for and find if that number is divisible by 7. For example, if you're trying to understand if number 133 is divisible by 7, well, what number close to 133 is divisible by 7? That number is 140, because 140 is simply 7 times 2 and then times 10. Well, if you subtract 7 from 140, you're going to get to 133, and that tells us that 133 is divisible by 7. That's the easiest rule that actually works for any type of a number. Some of the easier numbers have easier divisibility rules, but that rule works for any number. There's one number, though, that's very interesting, and the GMAT does test the divisibility by that number. And many people don't know divisibility rule by that number, and GMAT tries to exploit it because a lot of people learn divisibility rules up to 10. But what about 11? There's a very easy divisibility rule by 11, and I'm going to show you how it works. It's very cool. Let's imagine that you're trying to decide if this number, 21,879, is divisible by 11. Well, what you can do is split this number into odd and even integers this way. Essentially, you're going to start from what we call the units digit, and then what you're going to do is you're going to add all of the digits, skipping 1 as you go along. And you're going to get, in this case, 19. Now, of course, we skipped some digits. We have to add them up as well. We're going to get an 8. And if we subtract one from the other, we're going to get a number 11. As long as this number is divisible by 11, even if it's 0, and you already know by now that 0 is a multiple of any number, so if you get 0 here as well, 0 is divisible by 11, then 21,879 is also divisible by 11. So it's a really cool divisibility rule. Sometimes the GMAT gives you questions. I've seen one question on the GMAT that had 50 different numbers, and it's almost impossible, of course, or nearly impossible, or absolutely impossible to divide the number of those 50 digits by 11. But as long as you notice the pattern and you know this rule, you can deal with that problem very easily. So that's really a little bit of an introduction about the numbers theory. I wanted to give you also a bit of an introduction to algebra, because algebra is the second largest area of math that's tested on the GMAT. And what algebra really is all about is this. Let's just say there's something we don't know. Let's call it X. And if we don't know two things, let's call them X and Y, or A or B. That's really what it's all about. Algebra is really cool. It's also a very young area of math. It's only been around for about 1,000 years, whereas arithmetic is like up to 65,000 years old. So to understand algebra, you really need to understand the three building blocks of algebra. And here they are. Number one, variables. These are all of the things you don't know. We call them variables. Number two, expressions. If you put the variables together, let's say a plus b or a plus 3 divided by 2, this is what's called an expression. And if you don't know the variables yet, or the values of the variables, then you can essentially keep this expression in this form, but as soon as you find out what the a and b are, you could find out the value of an expression as well. Now, usually to find the value of an expression, you need the third thing, the third building block, which is a relationship. And there are two types of relationships on the GMAT, or actually in algebra, but specifically on the GMAT as well, equations and inequalities. Of course, equations are tested very, very often. Inequalities are a little bit rare, actually much more common in data sufficiency, which is one of the question type that's unique to the GMAT. So let's talk about equations. What type of equations could they throw at you? Well, they could throw at you a linear equation. And of course, how do you know you have an equation? Well, you have an equal sign. So here's an example of a linear equation. Don't need to have just one variable. You could have more than one variable. So you could have multiple solutions, but still you do not multiply variables onto other variables. You do not square or cube the variables. And that's why we call these linear equations. You can also have, and this is something that the GMAT also likes to throw in, a linear equation with an absolute value. Makes it a little bit trickier because even though y could be a negative or a positive number, the y absolute value of y is always positive, and that places certain restrictions on even what the x could be. They can also give you a quadratic equation. Here's an example of a quadratic equation where x squared. They can also give you equations of higher power. For example, a cubic or equation of a fourth power. Again, you don't need to have any advanced knowledge of calculus, which is an area of algebra, in order to deal with these questions. All you have to do is recognize that you can factor out x from this equation, and then you can deal with it as if it's a quadratic equation. There are also equations with variables and exponents, such as x to the power of y is equal to 1. Again, usually you're dealing with integers, so there are very easy ways to deal with these equations. You do not need to have a logarithmic calculator to deal with these questions on a test. Now, let me show you a couple of equations, and we'll learn how to deal with them. A linear equation, of course, this is a very simple linear equation. How do you deal with it? I'm sure you remember that in order to find the x, you have to isolate the x. And to isolate the x, we need to use the number one tool in algebra, which is to keep things in balance. If you can imagine, you have something on the left side, something on the right side. As long as you do the same thing to both sides of the equation, your equation will still remain an equation. That's why it's very important to do the same thing to both sides. So what can we do? Well, we can subtract 5 from both sides. We're going to end up with 3x is equal to 9. And then we can divide both sides by 3, and we'll end up with x is equal to 3. That is what we call the solution, or the root to this equation. If we substitute it back into the original equation, the left-hand side will be equal to the right-hand side. We always kept things in balance, and that's why we found x. That's really, it's really that simple, and that's what you're going to have to do on a test if you are ever faced with a linear equation. And of course, if it's a data sufficiency question, if you simply are asked whether you can answer this question, then you don't even have to answer it. You can just recognize that it's a one equation with one unknown. You can isolate the x by doing the same thing to both sides. Now, what if you have a quadratic equation? This is an example of a quadratic equation. Let me ask you a question. Do you remember that sometimes in high school there was a formula? Now let me ask you, do you remember the actual formula? If you don't worry. This is a formula. You do not have to write it down. It will not show up on a test. There's a better way to dealing with quadratic equations. And here's the way. All you have to do is recognize that quadratic equations essentially are the multiplication of two brackets. And I'm sure that you remember what's a FOIL. A FOIL is the way to multiply two brackets. A plus B times C plus D. You take the first, the outside, the inside, and then the last. So if we were to take this quadratic equation and imagine, let's just hallucinate for a moment that this quadratic equation actually is the same as this equation. Now just trust me on this one for a moment. We're going to do a FOIL on this equation. Now, of course, if you have this equation, it's very, very easy to solve it because x is either -3 or -4. It's very, very easy. But if we do the FOIL, here's what we're going to end up with. X squared, and then we take the first, then the outside, the inside, then the last, and we'll end up with our quadratic equation. So in order to deal with this quadratic equation, all you have to realize is, well, the numbers 4 and 3 add up to a 7, and they multiply to a 12. So if I look at the original quadratic equation, all I have to do is find two numbers that multiply to 12 add to a 7. And these numbers, of course, are 3 and 4 because there are not too many factors of 12. And you can find a pair of factors. It's 1 and 12, 2 and 6, and 3 and 4. Only one pair adds up to a 7, and of course 3 and 4. And that's how you deal with this quadratic equation. Of course, you have to remember to change the sign at the end because the actual solutions are -3 and -4. Because if x plus 3 is equal to 0, then x is equal to -3. Okay. Now, so this area of algebra equations is a very, very big area. There's another area, which is everything has to do with exponents. And exponents is really, again, you may remember, is just multiplying the number onto itself multiple times. And as long as you remember this, you can actually come up with all of these rules by simply writing down on a piece of paper, on your laminated pad, a few numbers, you multiply them all out, and you figure out these rules. Of course, it's going to be helpful to remember them so you can save some time. All of these rules have to deal with multiplication or division of exponents, as long as exponents have either the same power or the same base. Okay, so imagine you learn all of these rules and you're faced with a question that looks like this. Oh my. And a lot of people are looking at this and saying, well, where do I start? What's the rule? What's the rule that I need to use? And they say, well, I learned some rules. So I believe the rule is if we have the same exponents, we need to add the bases. And here's what they're going to do. They're going to say, okay, 2 to the 6 plus 2 to the 6, 4 to the 6. I add the 3's as well. I get a 9. It looks like E is the right answer, but I'm not quite sure because, well, now if I have these exponents also, what if I add these bases? Then it's 13 to the power of 6. So I'm going to spend some time deciding between B and E, and I'm going to pick E because it kind of seems right. Looks like I've used the right rule, seems right, I'm going to pick this. But there's one problem. We only spent 2 minutes figuring out what the rule is, but this is not the right answer. Because remember what we just said, the rules are all about multiplication and division. They're not about addition. So how do we deal with addition? Well, then you can learn some strategies. And one of the strategies is you could look at these numbers, you can factor out something in common. For example, 2 to the power of 6 is in common. And then in brackets, you can have 1 plus 1. That will lead you to 2 to the power of 7. And now you can actually apply the rules. You can do the same with 3 to the 6. And then you realize, well, it has to be 2 to the 7 plus 3 to the 7. Again, you look at A, it looks a little confusing, not really sure if it's the same as 2 to the 7 plus 3 to the 7, because a lot of people work in a very linear fashion. They read everything from top to bottom and left to right. And then eventually they'll recognize that it's got to be C, and in 2 minutes we got this question right. Well, you may remember from the first question that there's an even better way, and that's a mastery way. And this way is recognizing that there's no rule for adding exponents. You can just immediately recognize, hey, I know the rules. There's no such rule. So what I need to do is convert addition to multiplication. here's what I can do. I could say, well, look, 2 to the 6 plus 2 to the 6, that's twice 2 to the 6. That's like saying x plus x, that's 2x, right? So that gives us 2 to the 7. Whatever we do with 3 to the 7 is not going to affect that first part, because 3 to the 7 or 3 to the 6 3 times is going to have its own part. There's only one answer choice with 2 to the 7. We have these different bases 2 to the 7, 2 and 3. We can't really do anything, so the answer has to be C, and we can get this question right in only 30 seconds. And that's a type of thinking and a type of insights that you will need to develop if you want to get a score that's very close to 700. So let me ask you a question. Is knowledge power? I mean, we always say, well, knowledge is power, right? So if you have knowledge, you're very, very powerful. Well, let me give you an analogy. Imagine that you and I are trying to learn how to swim. And I say, okay, I'm going to give you all of the knowledge that you can possibly get in this amazing book that is titled How to Swim. Everything you need to know. What I'm going to do, though, I'm not going to read any books. I'm going to go and watch this gentleman swim. And of course, as you know, this is Michael Phelps. And then if I'm lucky, I'm actually going to get in a pool with him, and I'm going to ask him, what am I doing wrong? Can you tell me what are some of the tips and strategies, and then give me some feedback? Who do you think is going to have better results? So knowledge is no longer power. Knowledge used to be power. Now your ability to use this knowledge, having the right skills to use the knowledge, that's power. Because knowledge is commoditized. You can get knowledge by just simply Googling it, and in 15 seconds, all of the knowledge is in front of you. But how to use it and how to really think outside the box, that's power. And let's take a look at what the GMAT tells us. Rather than testing your knowledge of business or any subject matter, imagine you're trying to get into a business school, you do not need to know anything about the business. The GMAT exam measures higher order reasoning skills, the skills that matter in the management classrooms and the 21st century workplace. You will need basic and operating, not an expert knowledge of geometry, algebra, statistics, and the English language to demonstrate different types of reasoning skills. And who said this? GMAT, the creators of the GMAT. They tell us it's all about the skills, not really about knowledge. Very, very important. Now, okay, just to hammer this point home, let me show you this. This gentleman, I'm sure you know who this is. He is making $1.3 million an hour even when he sleeps. 86 years old. Do you think he has a very good memory in memorizing things? But do you think he has the right skills to make the right decisions and the right insights and really thinking outside the box? That's really what the power of the skills versus the memorization is. You may have learned a lot of things with memorization. That's how a lot of people are trying to study. Look, they're just saying, okay, this is an exam. I'm used to learning by memorizing because that's how our school system has conditioned us to memorize. And then they go into a bookstore and they're saying, they go to Barnes & Nobles or they go to Amazon and they're saying, okay, this amazing book, it's called The Official Guide. I'm going to get it because it's official. It's got to be the best. And they pick up this book and they realize, well, this book doesn't really teach me anything. It gives me a lot of theory and a lot of questions, but doesn't teach me how to do the questions. And then they say, well, I just need more books. And they go and pick up, the 10 or 12 books. And then they feel completely overwhelmed because they're trying to memorize what's in these books. And there's almost 3,000 pages in these books. And then they're saying, okay, look, I just need something complete. The book, online, DVD, mobile. I'm just going to study for the GMAT when I'm on a bus, when I'm driving. And at them at some point, they overwhelmed. They're saying, I just need to crack it. GMAT is some sort of an egg. All I have to do is crack it. And then I'm going to be good. And then if that doesn't work, they're saying, look, I just need something the most up-to-date. Now, a lot of these books are really good. And this book, for example, was written by my very good friend, Bobby Umar, who is teaching for us as well. But it's very easy to feel overwhelmed because a lot of people are using the books for the wrong purpose. They're trying to memorize what's in the books. And as a result, this is the result that they were getting, an average 552. That's the average GMAT score. And with that score, you can't really get very far. Well, we have reliable data here at Admit-Master because we really teach the skills in class. We teach people how to think differently. And we're saying, okay, look, let's just put our money where our mouth is and let's see what results our students will get because we're going to teach them the skills and not load them up with 12 different books. Here are the results that our students get. Our program is very, very personal, very high touch, small classes, very personal. So we know where our students go and what schools they go to. They all report their scores to us, and we know that the average is 670. And that's really the testament of the difference between the skills and the memorization. So now that we talk, this is really a skills-based exam. And I promised at the beginning of this webinar, I'm going to share with you the step-by-step process of how to get to very, very high scores. So we've now come to this point that I'm going to share this with you. Well, imagine this. The GMAT is a skills-based exam, right? Measuring skills, not the knowledge. So if you can think of any exam that you've taken in your life that's a skills-based exam, most of you have taken this exam, and that's a driving test. What's the first step that you took when you were studying for the driving test? Well, you learned some rules, right? That's exactly what you have to do in the GMAT as well. Learn some rules. And that's what we're learning today. There's actually more to it. Step number 2, you need to get some coaching. Get some coaching from a really, really good skills-based program, or some coaching with a private tutor who is really, really experienced, or even if you have a friend who scored very highly and knows how the test works, you can get some coaching as well. But it's very important that you actually get outside of your own level of thinking, because you are staying within your own box of thinking, and sometimes you just don't know what exists on the GMAT, what's out there. So getting outside coaching is really, really helpful, and it's not that expensive. You don't need that much. For example, all of our programs come with some private coaching, and our program is less expensive than most of the courses out there. And of course, step number 3 is you need to gain some confidence and practice enough to be really, really good at this skill. Now, when we bring this back to the GMAT, again, the 3 success factors. Just like with every skill, you need to do 3 things. Number 1, learn the rules, which is the theory. That's what we're doing today, definitions and formulas and math. We're going to talk about the verbal rules as well in 4 weeks. Strategies, methodologies, process, shortcuts. That's the most important thing, the shortcuts. And finally, the practice questions and practice tests. You need to do a lot of practice questions, practice tests to be very, very confident and be able to get very high results. Again, if you study with us, we don't assume that you know anything about the GMAT. We don't assume that you do the theory exercises. We give you the theory exercises before you come to the first class. We check on you, and if you're not ready, if you haven't done them, we can ask you to come to a later class. Or we might give you a call and say, what's happening? Now, of course, in class, you're going to learn the strategies, you're going to do lots of homework, and then you're going to continue after the class is finished, and we'll stay in touch. We'll give you some private tutoring because we want to make sure you can master this test. Okay, so let me ask you a question. Do you believe that you are your own biggest asset? Warren Buffett certainly thinks so. Do you also believe that there's a different way to learn? There's a way to learn by simply learning, well, this is a game. I want to learn how to play this game because I know lots of kids play this game. I want to learn how to play this game as well. But you know what? There's a different question you can ask yourself. How do I win this game? Ask yourself a better question, you're going to find a better answer. And finally, do you believe that learning should be fun? Because you know what? We are expected as adults to learn boring stuff. Unfortunately, we're expected to learn boring stuff, but we cannot learn boring stuff because we don't really have time to get into this, but we can talk a lot about the way our mind works. We spend a lot of time even in our course teaching our students how to learn. And one of the things that's very important is if we have a subconscious mind, all the learning happens in subconscious mind, all your memory is there. Your subconscious mind is like a 5-year-old child. It can only learn by having fun. So if you learn something that's really boring, you're not going to retain anyway. So if you answered yes to all of these questions, then you need something that's more skills-based. You can come and study with us. We offer classroom courses in these 4 cities, Toronto, New York, Chicago, and Montreal, and also online anywhere in the world. We have clients in Thailand, in Germany, in Costa Rica that are taking our online program. Our online program, all of our programs come with coaching. During this coaching, we will really guide you through this program. It's not a live online program, but it's also not a self-paced program. You're working with a coach and you're taking some classes, and we provide all of the study materials. In fact, we'll mail you the study materials anywhere in the world for free, and we'll let you even retake these classes, whatever classes you take, in all of these cities and also online for 1 year. And as you can see, our program costs less than most of the other programs, $13.99 if you take it in person, that's in US dollars, and $10.99 if you take it online. If you're in Europe or if you're in Canada, then we'll have Canadian and European prices as well. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. You can go on our website, check this out, reach out to me. But as you could see, really, this course costs a little bit less than most of the other courses, but the most important thing, it has a lot of value built in. It's really all about the value and not just the price. We wanted to give you something special for this class. And if you join any of our programs online or in person, we're going to give you $100 off as long as you quote this special code HULT 100. So write this down, and just as long as you let us know, we are going to honor this discount as well. Now, I'm just going to wrap up here with saying one thing, and I'll pass this back to Darren. If there was any time in life where you really wanted something and you didn't get it, like people are saying, look, I really want to go to this amazing school, it's in Boston, it's in London. We have a client that I was just talking recently to. She just graduated from Hult in Dubai, and she was just saying this was the best decision she ever got in her life. If you really, really want something in life and you don't get it, there's usually an excuse. Some people are saying, I don't really have the time. But you know what? The time in life is all about knowing the shortcuts. It's not about doing things faster. It's about doing less and getting to your results quicker. That's true of studying for the GMAT. It's true of doing any questions. I love these quotes from Beat the GMAT, this week's most inspirational GMAT MBA stories. There are lots of people on the Beat the GMAT, very good website, social network, a lot of people sharing their stories. And this person was saying he got from 530 to 690 in 7 years. I mean, do you really want to study for 7 years? Your time's valuable. You're delaying your MBA. You might be delaying really having a job that you really love. Some people are saying, look, maybe I don't need any improvement. Maybe I'm already at a very high level. Well, I'm going to challenge you. Go on our website, adminmaster.com/free test. I'm going to send you a link to this, and you can just take a practice test and see where you are and see if you need any improvement. As a bonus, we're going to give you a 7-day trial of our online platform. You can use it completely free, no credit card needed. You just sign up with an email address, and then you can use this platform, and you can take some lessons as well. Some people saying, look, I don't have the money. But my answer to this is, look, you're about to go to a business school. You're about to take your career to the next level. You'll spend a lot of money on the business school and make even more money when you graduate. So this is kind of like saying, I'm about to buy a Lamborghini, but I don't have money for the gas, and I'm going to just stay there because I can't move from the gas station. And some people are saying, look, I don't really believe I can do it. And that is something I can't really help you with. I love this quote from Henry Ford. Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. If you don't think you can do it, I can't really help you. Or you can reach out and I can try to help you. And I want to close with just one thing. I wanted to show you this little question. And this is a very difficult question. As you could see, Aaron will jog from home at X miles an hour and walk back home by the same route at Y miles an hour. How many miles from home can Aaron jog so he spends a total of T hours jogging and walking? Wow. I feel like I need to read this several more times. And if you look at the answer choices, they're even more confusing. All these variables. So like when a lot of people when they look at this question, they just skip. They're just saying, oh my God, I'm so overwhelmed, I'm going to skip it. Some people who are trying to do it, again, the theory way, they remember that there's this formula, distance equal to rate times time. So if I write down a few things, distance from home and back home, and I'm going to, the T's are equal to each other and the D's are equal, and then I can try to write down some formulas. And after 5 minutes, I'm just going to give up because I'm getting nowhere close to where I need to be. Well, if you learn some strategies, you can say, okay, well, I know distance equal to rate times time, but there's another formula, total distance equal to average rate times time. And here's the formula for the average rate. I learned this formula. I can plug it back in, and I can do some manipulations. I can get to the right answer in 2 minutes. Okay, that's better because now I have a strategy recognizing there's a variation to this formula, and I can learn certain formulas. But there's an even better way. And a better way is, again, the mastery way, which is recognizing that certain operations they're doing here in the answer choices are illegal. And sometimes I ask my students, do you see anything in the answer choice? They're like, no. I say, duh. There's like, the answer choices are screaming to do something with them. Because look at what they're trying to do in C. They're trying to add the speed to the time. That's illegal. They're doing the same with D, and they're doing the same with E. So you're down to 2 answer choices by doing this really, really simple operation. And now if you look at A, because it seems simpler, then it gives us miles an hour divided by miles an hour times hours. Miles an hour and miles an hour cancel out. A gives us hours. We need miles, right? How many miles? That's the question. So the only answer that's left is C. 30 seconds, very difficult question, but we can do it because we know how to leverage what the GMAT gives us. So ladies and gentlemen, the choice is yours. You can take the blue pill and read a lot of books and try to memorize the formulas and go the theory way, but you probably won't get to very high results. Or you can learn some skills. And really, the GMAT's really all about the skills. If you would like to come study with us, I'd love to work with you. Make sure you check out our next verbal refresher class on Wednesday, October 25th, which is going to be in 4 weeks. We are going to follow up with you as well. But I wanted now to pass on back to Darren, who's going to share a few tips on the admissions. Darren?
Thank you, Sergey. And similar to learning all of these tools that you can implement as you're trying to master the GMAT, there are also some things that you can learn ahead of time as you're looking into business programs that you would like to apply to. And there, I did want to go over Hult's specific approach, as we do use a holistic approach. And when we're looking at the GMAT, the end goal is to get into a program. So at Hult, we want to get to know you as a candidate first. We bring people to the discussion through these webinars, also through one-to-one consultations that we have with our directors and prospective students, over the phone, even in person if that's an option, if we're in your city or you're close to one of our campuses. So we encourage you to start that conversation early, because we are here to help you see if this is the right fit, and also for us to get a sense early on if you would be a great candidate for our programs. We consider many things, not just the GMAT exam, which is, of course, an important piece of the application, but we consider many different pieces as we evaluate you as a candidate. We look at your education, your work history, your professional references, which really speak to how much you've accomplished in your career thus far, or in your studies if you're coming just out of an undergraduate program, and what would you be like in the classroom at our school. We also look at your essay, and we interview you to learn how you problem solve, how you think strategically, how you work through tough situations, and then, of course, consider your test scores. So given that we're looking at the entire picture, you really have many opportunities to shine. So as you do crack open the books, as you do look into taking a course with Admit Master to prepare for the GMAT, I want you to keep in mind that there are other ways that you can also be adding to your application and to really present yourself. We do separate the admission process into stages by starting first with a preliminary application. This is all done online. It only takes about 15 to 20 minutes and is very similar to a LinkedIn profile. It's giving us a sense of your education, your employment history, which of our campuses you would like to study on. These sections are very brief, but they're a great way for you to get started and to show to us as a school that you're interested in the program. Once that preliminary application is submitted, we then offer our support by helping you gather your supporting documents, such as your professional references, your essays, your transcripts. We also invite you to an interview, and we'll eventually be asking for those required test scores, possibly including the GMAT or the GRE. So again, there's many ways for you to show us what type of a candidate you are before we even look at that one standardized test score. And throughout this whole process, you will be assigned 2 people who will be references for you, one being your enrollment director, and then the other being your application manager. Hult does have a few GMAT requirements. The first being that your GMAT score must be less than 5 years old. So do make sure that at the point of your application, you have an updated GMAT score. We also accept a range of scores. Many schools will say that they don't have a limit. There's no minimum score requirement, but we, of course, are looking for a range, something in the 600s. If it's 650 and above, will actually help you towards an academic excellence scholarship. But we do accept both the GMAT and the GRE. So if you feel that one test is more applicable to your unique learning style than the other, then feel free to move forward with that. And lastly, we also have some more admissions tips. First, at Hult, your enrollment director is not admissions. So don't be shy about sharing your score with us, and we will then help you assess the best course of action. We want to, if it's something that you're incredibly nervous about, be able to walk you through that process and share what the admissions committee might be considering and expecting for your specific profile. Also, a high GMAT can make up for other weaknesses in the application. Very rarely are you able to excel in every single piece of the application. There might be a lower GPA that you had. There might be a letter of recommendation that you're a little unsure of. Just use the GMAT as a way to make up for those weaknesses. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, a lower GMAT score that you might not be incredibly proud of can be corrected with possibly an internal exam or a second attempt. Some students do take the GMAT exam a couple of times. So if your first time is not successful, don't be frustrated. Don't give up. And finally, there is a practice test, a free simulation at admitmaster.com/free test. So look online, look at these resources that AdmitMaster has. Our website also has one at hult.edu. There's a lot of free information out there that you can at least be taking advantage of as you're honing in on your studies and really gathering all of this information to make sure you're the most prepared moving forward. And one deadline we wanted to keep in mind is our October 24th round one deadline. We at Hult are actually offering an early application grant to candidates that submit just that preliminary application that I mentioned a few slides back by this date, October 24th. If you're interested, reach out to us at hult.edu. If you're already in a conversation with an enrollment director, please feel free to mention this to him or her so that they can be sure to go over what we would need in order to have you considered for that early application grant. But we want to make sure that for students that are showing interest early on, that they benefit it, not just by allowing yourself plenty of time to prepare for the GMAT, but also by allowing yourself a lot of opportunities throughout the admissions process.
Well, thank you so much, Darren, for sharing these amazing tips. There will be more tips at the verbal refresher class on October 25th. We'll get a little bit deeper into the application process as well. If you are only beginning to study, you can check our website at the GMAT Mastery All-Inclusive Prep Programs. They're 48 hours in class. They're very, very intensive, but also very comprehensive. You can take them anytime online. And the next program, actually in all 4 cities, Toronto, Chicago, Montreal, and New York, start on October 15. Make sure you register using this code. And if you are only beginning to really consider what your options are with the application, make sure you reach to Darren. And if you are only beginning to consider your options for the GMAT prep, or you're trying to understand how should I study, what's my personal situation, because everybody is unique, then please reach out to me. You can also go on our website, admitmaster.com, and book a free consultation, and we'll reach back to you and we'll help you with your study plan. Again, it is completely free, so you can reach out to both me and Darren anytime.
Excellent. And we do have a couple of questions that have come through. The first being, will we be sharing the link in a follow-up email? The answer is yes. We want you to be able to refer back to all of the materials that Sergey has reviewed and really use this as a guide as you take this next step forward. Also, someone asked, what is the average GMAT score for students admitted to Hult? The average is right around a 610, 620. But again, we accept a range of scores, and anything over a 650 would qualify you for consideration for the Academic Excellence Scholarship. And Sergey, I see one for you. Do you have any advice on some time-saving methods when candidates are solving factorial questions in the GMAT?
Yes, when it comes to factorial, all you have to do is recognize what is a factorial. A lot of the things on the GMAT are really about understanding instead of memorizing. So when you're dealing with factorial questions, it's simply a multiplication. All right, so deal with a multiplication question and write this out as essentially a chain, and then figure out how you can, what numbers can you multiply first to get to the answer quicker. If you'd like to email me personally, I'm happy to give you some more tips and connect with you. Somebody also, Brian, asked, how much time do you recommend to study for the GMAT? That's very individual. If you go on our website and take a practice test and you recognize what is your starting score, then you'll be able to know, and I can give you advice on how much time it could take you. A few things go into this: your starting score, your target score, and how much time you can spend per week. But I can tell you, for most people who study with us, and our average score improvement of people who come to our program is almost 200 points. So it's a very, very big improvement. Most of the students who study with us study for about 3 to 4 months. That includes 6 weeks in class.
Excellent. And Sergey, it looks like we have one final question, and this is actually a great one as we're looking to the future and people are mapping out their GMAT journey. Do you have any tips for international students?
Absolutely. One thing about being an international student is English may not be your first language. So you might have a little bit of fear of the GMAT because there's this verbal section. Now, one thing that you need to recognize is that the verbal section is really not about knowing English. It is really all about knowing certain structures of written English. It's not about, I always joke with my students, you don't even have to speak a word of English to do very well on a test. Now, you won't be able to get into a business school, of course, but if you are an international student, one of the things that I would recommend is your admissions deadlines are usually earlier because you need to get a visa. So start earlier, and also don't discount the fact that there's a lot of things to read on the GMAT. So start reading more. Read things such as The Economist, the Harvard Business Review, magazines, or even some scientific magazines that will help you getting much more comfortable with reading. Again, we work with clients all over the world, so if you are not from North America, please reach out and I can give you some individual tips as well.
Excellent, Sergey. And from an admissions perspective, also coming into Hult specifically as an international student, we have on any of our given campuses, 90% of our students are international. So this is an environment that we certainly want to foster and maintain, and it's really an asset to the program. I think that's one of the most unique factors about the school. You will constantly have exposure to different perspectives as you're working alongside students from all over the world, but also all different industry backgrounds and professions. And I encourage you all to come back to this webinar, come back to our websites and continue asking these questions. Reach out to us directly. If we can't answer, we can certainly point you in the right direction. But I hope that this was a very entertaining but also knowledgeable time for all of you, and we look forward to our next one again in October so that we can tackle the other part of the GMAT, which is the verbal section. So just wanted to thank Sergey again for helping us today and for offering up all of your advice, and we look forward to next time.
Thank you so much, Darren. There's one question that I thought you might want to answer is whether candidates should begin online application for Hult or wait until the GMAT is done.
Oh, great question. I'm happy you mentioned that. So We recommend, if you don't have your GMAT score now, don't let that deter you. You can start an online application, you can submit it, and even move through the entire admissions process without having your GMAT score ready. It's something that can be added later on. So you can be evaluated on a conditional acceptance basis, and this is actually rather strategic because you'll have these conversations with your enrollment director, you'll have your interview with admissions, and really get a sense of what type of a score should you be aiming at given your background and your overall application. So if you don't have the GMAT now, but you would like to take advantage of these early application opportunities, including that early application grant that I mentioned, don't hesitate. It's never too early to start, especially if you're looking at 2018 admissions for the fall. Now is a great time to submit that preliminary application and work towards getting ready for next fall.
Okay, perfect. Somebody was asking, where do we get more information, how to sign up? Rebecca was asking, I'm not really sure what you've mentioned in terms of sign up, but we will share tips and resources as well, and we'll share some links, and Darren is going to share some links as well by email. So please look in your email for follow-up communication. And again, you could reach out to both Darren and myself with any of the questions, and we can help you individually.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, everyone, for tuning in and for being so active. And we look forward to connecting again in the future.
Thank you, Darren.
Thank you, Sanjay. Bye.
Bye-bye.